Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood, was a man carved from shadows and silent promises. He was devastatingly handsome, with skin the color of warm teak, thick obsidian hair that always seemed to defy the neatness of his station, and eyes so dark they looked like endless midnights. He was the kind of man who didn't need to speak to command a room. His mere presence, heavy with an unspoken intensity, was enough to make the air grow thin. And I, Eleanor Vance, with my pale skin and hair the color of spun starlight, was the woman who had been sold to him to settle a debt. But the price was stranger than I had imagined. On the eve of our wedding, under the silver glow of a crescent moon, he had looked down at me from his towering height and made a vow that felt like a challenge. "I will give you my name, Eleanor. I will give you my fortune. But I will never touch you. My bed will remain mine alone, and you shall remain untouched by the darkness that follows me." It was a ridiculous, infuriating promise. Especially when his gaze lingered on the curve of my neck with a hunger that contradicted every cold word he spoke. The first few weeks at Blackwood Hall were a masterclass in exquisite torture. We lived like two ghosts haunting the same elegant corridors. Arthur was a master of avoidance, yet I felt him everywhere. I felt his eyes on me during dinner, tracing the line of my collarbone as I breathed. I heard the low, gravelly rumble of his voice in the library, discussing estate matters, a sound that made a traitorous shiver run down my spine. He was a man of sharp wit and even sharper defenses. One afternoon, I found him in the gallery, staring at a portrait of a grim ancestor. "You are brooding again, Your Grace," I said, my voice intentionally light, honeyed with a provocation I didn't know I possessed. He didn't turn, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "It is my primary occupation, Eleanor. Surely your father warned you that dukes are prone to fits of gloom." I stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and expensive brandy wafting from him, making my head swim. "He mentioned the gloom. He failed to mention that you were also a coward." That made him turn. His dark eyes flashed with a sudden, dangerous fire. "A coward," he repeated, stepping into my personal space until I had to tilt my head back to look at him. "I am protecting you, you foolish girl." I didn't flinch. "Protecting me from what? A husband's touch? Or the fact that you want me so badly it terrifies you?" The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. His gaze dropped to my lips, and for a second, I thought he would break his precious vow right then and there. His hand reached out, his long, dark fingers hovering just an inch from my cheek, close enough for me to feel the heat radiating from his skin. But then, he pulled back, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. "Go to your rooms, Eleanor. Before I forget that I am a gentleman." I left, but the victory was mine. I had seen the crack in his armor. I had felt the electricity that crackled between us, a tether of pure, unadulterated desire. I decided then that if Arthur Sterling wanted to play a game of restraint, I would be the one to set the rules. I began to choose gowns of the finest silk, creams and pale golds that made my skin look like porcelain and clung to every curve of my body. I made sure to stay in the rooms he frequented, reading by the fire, letting the light play off my hair. I caught him watching me often, his dark face tight with a hunger he couldn't hide, his knuckles white as he gripped his book or his glass of wine. The tension reached a fever pitch on the night of the harvest moon. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the electricity of a coming storm. I was in the music room, playing a haunting, melodic piece that echoed the restlessness in my soul. I didn't hear him enter, but I felt him. The air in the room changed, becoming charged and heavy. I stopped playing, the final note hanging in the air like a question. "Don't stop," he said from the shadows. His voice was low, intimate, stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. I turned on the bench to find him leaning against the doorframe, his cravat loosened, his shirt unbuttoned at the throat to reveal the bronze skin beneath. He looked raw, beautiful, and completely undone. "I didn't think you cared for music, Arthur," I whispered. He walked toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. "There are many things I care for that I try very hard to ignore." He stopped right in front of me, his knees brushing against the silk of my skirts. The height difference was staggering. He looked like a dark god looming over a mortal. "Why do you do it?" he asked, his voice a strained growl. "Why do you wear those dresses? Why do you look at me as if you want me to devour you?" I rose slowly, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I placed my hands on his chest, feeling the heavy, powerful thud of his heart beneath the fine linen. "Because I do, Arthur. And because your promise was a lie from the moment you uttered it. You don't want to stay away from me. You're starving for me." He let out a sound that was half groan, half laugh, his hands coming up to grip my waist. His touch was electric, a searing heat that burned through the silk of my gown. "You have no idea what you're asking for, Eleanor. If I start, I won't be able to stop. I will ruin you for any other man. I will mark you as mine in every way possible." My breath hitched as his thumbs traced the curve of my hips. "Then ruin me," I defied him, my voice trembling but certain. "I would rather be ruined by you than saved by anyone else." He didn't wait for another word. His mouth crashed down onto mine with a ferocity that stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a reclamation. It tasted of wine, of hunger, and of years of suppressed longing. His tongue teased mine, demanding entry, and I gave it willingly, my fingers tangling in the thick, dark silk of his hair. He groaned into my mouth, his hands sliding down to pull my hips flush against his. I could feel the hard, unmistakable evidence of his desire pressing against me, a promise of what was to come. He broke the kiss to trail a path of fire down my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin of my shoulder. "Eleanor," he gasped against my skin, his voice thick with need. "God, you are so beautiful. I've dreamed of this every night since I first saw you." He scooped me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing, his dark eyes never leaving mine. He didn't take me to my room. He took me to his, the sanctuary he had forbidden me from entering. The room was bathed in the amber glow of the fireplace. He set me down beside his massive, four-poster bed, his hands immediately going to the laces of my gown. He was efficient, his fingers trembling only slightly as he stripped away the layers of silk and lace until I stood before him in nothing but my chemise. His breath caught, his gaze traveling over my body with a reverence that made me feel more powerful than any queen. "Exquisite," he whispered. Then, he shed his own clothes with a hurried desperation, revealing a body that was a masterpiece of lean muscle and bronze skin. He was magnificent. When he pulled me onto the bed, the cool sheets felt like ice against my heated skin, but Arthur was fire. He moved over me, his weight a delicious pressure, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he looked down at me. "Are you sure, Eleanor? Once I touch you like this, there is no going back." I reached up, pulling his head down to mine. "I've been waiting for no going back my entire life, Arthur. Now, show me exactly what the Duke of Blackwood does at midnight." The air in the Duke's bedchamber was thick with the scent of wood smoke and a primitive, undeniable magnetism. Arthur moved with a deliberate slowness that was more agonizing than haste. His hands, large and calloused from years of riding, found the small of my back, pulling me so close that I could feel the frantic thrumming of his pulse against my own. "You have haunted me, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my temple. "Every time you walked into a room, every time you laughed, I felt the walls I built around my heart begin to crumble. I made that promise because I knew that once I touched you, there would be no world left but you. He leaned back just enough to look into my eyes, his expression a mixture of reverence and raw, unchecked hunger. I am a man who has always prided himself on control. But with you, I am nothing but a man starving for his son. I reached up, my fingers tracing the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw, the slight roughness of his evening stubble. Then stop starving, Arthur, I whispered. He didn't need to be told again. His mouth found mine with a renewed intensity, a deep, searching kiss that spoke of all the words he had been too proud to say. We tumbled onto the expansive bed, a sea of dark silk sheets that felt cool against our feverish skin. Arthur was everywhere, his hands mapping the curves of my waist, his lips trailing fire along my collarbone, his body a heavy, welcome weight above me. The contrast was breathtaking, my pale, porcelain skin against the deep, bronze tone of his muscular chest. He looked at me as if I were a miracle he didn't deserve, his dark eyes shimmering with a vulnerability that only I was allowed to see. He moved between my thighs, his movements fluid and filled with a desperate grace. "Tell me you want this," he gasped, his breath hitching as he felt me arch against him. "Tell me you are mine." I wrapped my legs around his waist, pulling him closer, wanting to erase every inch of distance between us. "I have been yours since the moment we stood in that garden, Arthur. I am yours, heart, body, and soul." With a low groan of surrender, he merged our bodies in one slow, powerful thrust. I gasped, the world tilting on its axis as a wave of pure, white-hot sensation washed over me. It wasn't just physical, it was an emotional cataclysm, a breaking of dams. He froze for a moment, his eyes searching mine, ensuring I was with him, and when he saw the desire reflecting back at him, he began to move with a rhythmic, primal intensity. The shadows of the room danced on the walls, mimicking the tangled dance of our limbs. Every movement was a conversation, a dialogue of skin on skin. He knew exactly where to touch, exactly how much pressure to apply, as if he had memorized my body in his dreams. I found myself crying out his name, my fingers digging into the muscles of his back, anchoring myself in the storm. The tension built, a coil of gold and fire tightening within me until I thought I would shatter. Arthur was relentless, his own pleasure clearly tied to the sounds of my undoing. "Look at me, Eleanor," he commanded, his voice thick with the approaching peak. I opened my eyes to see him, the ice duke no more, but a man consumed by the very fire he had tried to extinguish. In that moment of absolute connection, we both let go, a shared explosion of sensation that left us breathless and clinging to each other in the aftermath. As our breathing slowed and the silence of the night reclaimed the room, Arthur didn't pull away. He held me tightly, his face buried in the crook of my neck, his heart still racing against mine. For the first time, the silence wasn't cold, it was a warm, protective cloak. He pulled the covers over us, tucking me into his side as if I were the most precious thing he owned. "The promise is dead," he whispered into the darkness, his voice now soft and filled with a newfound peace. "From this midnight forward, I promise you something else. I promise to never let a day go by without showing you exactly how much you are loved." I drifted toward sleep, listening to the steady beat of his heart, knowing that the man who had promised to never touch me had just given me the world. The morning light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the Duke's bedchamber felt different than any dawn I had ever known. For the first time, I didn't wake up alone in a cold, vast room. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic warmth of Arthur's breath against my hair. His arm was a heavy, protective weight across my waist, pinning me to him as if he feared I might vanish with the mist rising over the moors. I stayed still for a long moment, watching the way the soft gold of the sun played over his bronzed skin. Without the mask of the distant aristocrat, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. But as his eyes blinked open, those dark, stormy depths finding mine instantly, the raw intensity returned. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tightened his grip, pulling me upward until our lips were inches apart. "I should regret this," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep and a lingering hunger. "I should be repenting for breaking a vow I intended to keep until my dying day." I smiled, tracing the line of his collarbone. "And do you? Regret it?" He let out a low, rough growl, his mouth capturing mine in a kiss that was slow, deep, and thoroughly possessive. "I only regret the months I wasted pretending I didn't want to do exactly this." But the transition from a marriage of shadows to one of passion was not without its thorns. Arthur was a man used to solitude, a man who viewed his own emotions as enemies to be conquered. While the nights in his bed were a symphony of shared heat and whispered confessions, the days remained a battlefield of wit and pride. At breakfast, the long mahogany table still sat between us, but the air was now thick with a different kind of tension. I caught him watching me over the rim of his coffee cup, his gaze dropping to the swell of my breasts beneath my morning gown, his eyes darkening with a memory of the night before. "You are quiet today, Eleanor," he remarked, his voice smooth as silk. "Is the Duchess finding the reality of her marriage more taxing than the fantasy?" I arched an eyebrow, setting my teacup down with a deliberate click. "On the contrary, Your Grace. I find that reality has a much better appetite. I was merely wondering if you intended to hide me away in this castle forever, or if you are brave enough to show London that the ice duke has finally melted." His expression shifted, a flash of the old coldness flickering in his eyes before it was replaced by a smirk that made my stomach flip. "London is a den of vipers, Eleanor. They don't deserve to see you. They would see the glow in your skin and know exactly how I spent my midnight. And I find I am a very selfish man when it comes to my treasures." The word treasure sent a bolt of heat through me. It was the way he said it, not as an object to be owned, but as something to be guarded with a ferocity that bordered on lethal. Yet, I knew he was still holding back. There was a part of his soul he kept under lock and key, a secret room in the fortress of his heart that even our physical intimacy hadn't unlocked. He would give me his body, he would give me his protection, but he still spoke of himself as a man cursed, as if our love were a ticking clock waiting to strike a final, tragic hour. I decided to push him. That afternoon, I followed him to the stables. He was saddling his black stallion, his movements powerful and efficient. He wore no coat, only a white linen shirt that clung to the muscles of his back as he worked. When he saw me, he paused, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Looking for another lesson in bravery, Eleanor?" I walked right into his space, ignoring the horse's restless huffing. "I'm looking for the truth, Arthur. You said you were cursed. You said you kept your distance to save me. But here I am, perfectly healthy and more alive than I've ever been. Tell me about the woman in the portrait. Tell me why you think love is a death sentence." The air between us turned brittle. He dropped the leather cinch, his face hardening. "Some ghosts are better left in the dark, Eleanor. Do not go digging in graveyards you aren't prepared to walk through." "I am your wife," I countered, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "I have seen you at your most undone. You don't get to retreat into the shadows just because the sun is too bright." He stepped toward me, his presence suddenly overwhelming, his height casting a long shadow over me. He grabbed my wrists, not painfully, but with a desperate kind of strength. "My mother died giving birth to a sister who didn't survive the night," he hissed, his eyes burning with an old, jagged pain. "My father, a man who loved her with a madness that defied reason, followed her to the grave a year later because he simply forgot how to breathe without her." Love isn't a fairy tale in this house, Eleanor. It is a slow-acting poison. I promised to never touch you because I didn't want to love you. Because if I love you, and the world takes you away, there will be nothing left of me but ash. The raw honesty of his fear left me breathless. It was the ultimate irony. He was terrified of his own capacity to love. I pulled my hands from his grip and cupped his face, forcing him to look at me. "Then let us burn together, Arthur," I whispered, my lips brushing against his. "I would rather have a week of your love than a century of your silence. You are not your father, and I am not a ghost. I am a woman who wants her husband, all of him." The anger in his eyes dissolved into something much more dangerous, an all-consuming need. He didn't say a word. He simply hoisted me up, sitting me on the hay-strewn workbench behind us, his hands sliding up my thighs with a frantic, renewed hunger. The stables were cold, the air smelling of hay and leather, but as Arthur buried his face in my neck, his breath hot and demanding, the world outside Blackwood Hall ceased to exist. We were no longer a duke and a duchess, we were two souls fighting against a destiny of loneliness, finding our salvation in the very touch he had once sworn to deny. The following days were a blur of delicious, agonizing contradictions. Arthur was a man possessed, caught between the instinct to flee and the primal need to stay anchored within my arms. He had finally shared the source of his darkness, the fear of a love that destroys, but knowing the truth didn't make the air between us any less volatile. If anything, it made every touch feel like a stolen moment before a storm. He began to seek me out at odd hours, his shadow falling over my book in the library, his hand brushing mine as we walked through the rose gardens. There was a new, desperate edge to his wit. "You are looking at me again, Eleanor," he murmured one afternoon, his voice low enough to make the gardener 3 rows over blush. "With that expression that suggests you are calculating exactly how many buttons are between you and my skin." I didn't look away, leaning back against a stone fountain. "Only 3, I believe. Though the way you're gripping that riding crop suggests you're thinking of far more scandalous calculations than I am." He let out a sharp, surprised laugh, the kind that transformed his face from a stern mask into something breathtakingly handsome. But the laughter died quickly, replaced by a gaze so smoldering it felt like a physical caress. "You are a dangerous woman, Duchess. You make me forget my ancestors, my fears, and my very sanity." He stepped closer, the heat of the afternoon sun nothing compared to the warmth radiating from him. "Tell me, if I were to take you right here, amidst the lilies and the prying eyes of the staff, would you still call me a coward?" My breath hitched, my pulse leaping in my throat. "I would call you a man who has finally realized that life is meant to be lived, not curated behind glass." He reached out, his thumb tracing the fullness of my lower lip, his dark eyes fixed on the movement. "The glass is shattered, Eleanor. I just hope you don't mind the shards." That evening, the tension finally snapped. A heavy summer rain began to pelt the windows of Blackwood Hall, turning the world outside into a gray, watery dream. I was in my dressing room, wearing a sheer, silk nightgown that left very little to the imagination, a silent invitation for the man I knew was pacing the hallway. When the door opened, he didn't knock. Arthur stood there, his hair damp from the rain, his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders. He looked like a man who had reached the end of his endurance. He didn't speak, he simply crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands framing my face as he kissed me with a hunger that was almost frightening. It wasn't just desire, it was a reclamation of the soul. He pushed the silk from my shoulders, his eyes devouring the sight of my pale skin in the flickering candlelight. "I tried to stay away tonight," he groaned against my throat. "I told myself that one night of peace would be good for us. But the silence without you is a tomb." I pulled him toward the bed, my hands working the buttons of his shirt with a feverish haste. Then never give me silence again, Arthur. We fell onto the sheets, a tangle of limbs and gasping breaths. He moved over me with a renewed sense of purpose, his touch more confident, more demanding. He explored every inch of me as if he were trying to memorize my body with his fingertips. When he finally entered me, it was with a slow, agonizing depth that made me arch my back and cry out his name. He watched me, his dark face tight with the effort of restraint, wanting to prolong the pleasure until we were both on the brink of madness. "You are mine," he whispered, his voice a rugged vow. "In this bed, in this house, in every life I am forced to live. You are the only thing that is real." The climax was a tidal wave, a shattering of all the remaining walls between us, leaving us both trembling and exhausted in the cool, rain-scented air. But as I lay there, my head resting on his chest, I realized that while the physical walls had crumbled, the final barrier remained. He still spoke of love as if it were a debt he couldn't afford to pay. He held me as if he were holding a ghost, as if at any moment the curse he so feared would snatch me away. I listened to his heart, strong and steady, and I knew that the final battle wouldn't be fought in the bedroom, but in the deepest, most hidden corners of his mind. He had touched my body, and he had given me his pleasure, but he had yet to truly let me into his heart without the fear of loss poisoning the well. I closed my eyes, a silent plan forming. If the Duke of Blackwood wanted to live in fear of the future, I would have to show him that the present was the only thing that truly mattered. The days turned into weeks, and Blackwood Hall was no longer a tomb of silence, but a sanctuary of whispered promises and lingering touches. Yet, I knew that Arthur was still bracing himself for a blow from fate. The final wall only crumbled on a night when the heat of summer met the first cool breath of autumn. I found him in his study, not brooding over ledgers, but staring at the empty space on the wall where his mother's portrait used to hang. He turned as I entered, his dark eyes softening in a way that still made my breath hitch. "I moved it," he said simply, his voice low. I realized I was looking at the past to predict a future that hasn't happened yet. "You did that, Eleanor. You made the present so bright that the shadows have nowhere to hide." I walked to him, sliding my arms around his waist, feeling the solid, reassuring heat of his body. "The only curse in this house, Arthur, was the belief that you didn't deserve to be happy." He let out a long, ragged sigh, his forehead resting against mine. "I love you," he whispered, the words sounding like both a confession and a victory. "It is the most terrifying thing I have ever said, and the only truth that matters. I broke my promise to never touch you, and in doing so, you saved my life." He picked me up then, his strength effortless, and carried me to the window seat where the moonlight bathed us in silver. There was no haste this time, only a profound, searing intimacy. Every kiss was a vow, every touch a language of its own. As we merged together one last time that night, it wasn't just a fire of passion, but a hearth of belonging. The Duke of Blackwood was no longer a man of ice, he was a man who had found his home in the heart of the woman he had once sworn to ignore. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world.